Aloha, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dean, alongside my co-host. God damn it. We're keeping that in. Okay. Alongside my host, Chris. That's not my co-host. He's my host because if I say co-host again, he's going to fire me. I'm coming to you from beautiful Oahu. And Chris, where are you coming from today? PA?
From shitty cold Western Pennsylvania, where it is currently 30 degrees.
Woo. Don't feel too bad because in Hawaii right now, we're kind of getting the brunt of it for our quote unquote winter season. So we get
Which
a
is
lot
like
of rain,
what,
a lot of
70 degrees?
it's 68, it's a mild 68. So how much do you hate me now? We will get you out here someday and we will record out here someday and we will do another special on Hawaiian ghosts and deities and creepy cryptid stories.
Maybe we
Actually,
could go to locations and just do little segmented recordings. Maybe we
yeah,
could
man.
find
Yeah, and then if we get attached with some kind of spirit, it's going to stick with me because I'm going to stay on the island. And as you fly over the Pacific, it's going to ditch you and come back to me. So can't wait for that. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, but what are we talking about today, buddy? There's some semi-breaking
New
news.
data. Yeah. Breaking news. Supposedly, as some believe, I'm not so sure myself, but some believe that Jack the Ripper has finally been ID'd. What's his name, Chris?
They think it was Aaron Kosminski, who was a Polish barber who was operating in the general vicinity at the time, and he was actually a suspect for the murders. So
Yep.
through DNA evidence, I believe they DNA tested what would have been Kosminski's great grandniece, the great granddaughter of his older brother, off of a piece of evidence, a shawl.
Yeah, it supposedly belonged to, I think, the fourth of the five canonical victims, Catherine Eddowes.
Yes. So I believe that they took the DNA from the shawl and they tested descendants of Catherine Eddowes. They tested descendants of Jack the Ripper. As of a few days ago, there have been claims of 100% match, stating that it indeed was Aaron Kosminski.
Chris, you seem like you're a proponent for saying that this is fairly definitive evidence of unveiling who Jack the Ripper was, which is exciting. I totally admit. I'm not trying to be like a rain on your parade guy today,
But you are, though.
I will with science.
But the evidence comes with science.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're fighting science with science.
We are. So I will nerd all over this parade with my science. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to claim that I know exactly what all this means. I just have a general understanding of deoxyribonucleic acid. I said it right after 5 times. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. We all learned that in high school, right? So apparently there are 2 favorite tests for DNA testing, or 2 types, I mean. There's the nuclear DNA analysis, which is STR profiling. This method was not used for this recent finding for the potential killer who was possibly Jack the Ripper. This is the one that proponents would say would be more accurate because apparently it encapsulates and incorporates the concept of twinsmanship and like all kinds of DNA structures that would come out in a match that would make it more accurate. So like if you use this nuclear DNA testing, the accuracy is highly individual specific. So if you have a match using this method, that's admissible in a court of law for sure, especially if you have both sides of matching DNA that you can use to link together, as opposed to just having like, DNA on a piece of evidence. However, the dun for this finding, this new release, the mitochondrial DNA method of analysis was used. It's not necessarily an inaccurate test. So it is more durable. It's more durable and it has better outcomes in more cases than the nuclear DNA test. But the mitochondrial DNA test is pegged mostly to the maternal side of anybody who's related to that bloodline. So what does that mean? That basically means that it's possible that an individual can be confirmed as related to the person connected to the DNA, or you could also argue that the lineage, because it's maternal, could be spread across multiple generations, and that makes it less specific. I mean, that's the peg that I want to just start off with, and this is, to me, this is a really exciting find, and I think it possibly narrows down even more, getting closer to who was responsible. But do I think it's definitive finally in 2025? Do we have the definitive answer? I would say probably not. I'm sure a lot of people know who Jack the Ripper was, the way things played out, but let's do a refresher on that first.
Let's do a quick little bit of background on where Jack the Ripper was operating. Like
Important.
Dean said, if you're not familiar with Jack the Ripper, as a quick reminder, Jack the Ripper was one of the most infamous serial killers in history, responsible for a series of brutal murders in London's Whitechapel district in 1888. So, a little bit of background on the Whitechapel district. It's important to note that during the 1880s, London's East End, particularly Whitechapel, was overcrowded, impoverished, riddled with crime, homelessness, and prostitution. Many women there were often referred to as unfortunates, and they had to work as prostitutes to survive, making them vulnerable to violence. And the area was notorious for its dark, narrow alleys, making it an ideal hunting ground for a killer who could strike and vanish without a trace.
You know what else is crazy about that area at the time? If you look up maps of it, it's literally a maze. And you're talking about a time before widespread electricity. Don't even know if electricity would have trickled down to an area like that because it wasn't like that time period wasn't too much long after the advent of like telegraph and stuff like that. So I don't even know that it was probably all candlelight, candle poles and whatever. Like they used to have the people going around putting out the candles at night. So you're talking about a place that's basically like a death maze. It's like pitch black in certain parts. That's just creepy in and of itself. If you think about traversing the streets at night in Whitechapel in the most dangerous part of the city at that time, it's almost like this was inevitable. Like this sort of thing was going to happen. And it kind of did in a way, because as we were talking about before we hopped on this recording, there were actually lots of other unsolved murders, some of which might have been serial killer murders that were going on in and around this area around this like 10-year block of time in London. I think one that we should talk about at some point, I think there were 3 bodies at separate dates that were discovered that were just torsos. The heads were decapitated. And it's just like, it's funny to me that I learned about that. And it's like, no one's talking about that murder. Like, it's like Jack the Ripper is the lucky sensationalized version, but there were like a million other murders going on at the time in this area. So it was not a good place to be. And it was definitely the prime area, like you said, for serial killer to start taking hold and claiming victims.
About the area in general with the crime between April 3rd of 1888 to the 13th of February in 1891, there were multiple investigations by police that they essentially labeled the Whitechapel murders. So there were other murders that occurred, but the Canonical Five, which we'll get into, have widely been attributed to the work of Jack the Ripper. There were additional murders that took place. Like some of the first 2 cases in the Whitechapel murders file, they refer to those of Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram, who are not included in the Canonical Five of those that were murdered by Jack the Ripper. With Smith's murder, she was robbed and sexually assaulted in Whitechapel at approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 3rd of 1888. She had been bludgeoned in the face. She received a cut to her ear. There was a blunt object inserted into her vagina. She developed peritonitis and died in London hospital the next day.
I'm assuming she was unconscious, right? I mean, like, if she was conscious, they would have been all over her to give a description.
I guess she had some time to give a description. She said that she was attacked by 2 to 3 men whom she described as one of them she described as a teenager. It sounded like it was maybe some gang activity, and then the police and people doing the newspapers at the time attribute it to East End gang violence, which
Right.
completely unrelated.
Isn't that nuts? Can you imagine that? Like, you're talking about a time when the police force that was involved in and around this area at the time, I mean, they were known as the Metropolitan Police Service, so it's not Scotland Yard. It's not too much different from the structure that we see today, where you have precincts and you have like basically patrolmen, and then you also have detectives, and then you have your higher ups and whatnot. But the thing I find that you said that I find absolutely fascinating, that like just completely nails home the atmosphere, what's going on at this time. They said at the time it was possible gang violence. And like, what does that
Which
say
is
about the
not
severity of what was going on, right? Like, that's
right.
crazy.
Which is not out of the question. I mean, if you
Even for
look at
1888.
right, it's what do I always say when it
Humans
comes
are the
to
same.
humans are the same, doesn't matter the time period. The only thing that changes is the access to technology.
Yeah. More blunter objects. Blunt.
right?
Oh my god.
I don't mean to laugh at the severity of this, but
I know.
just I
Yeah,
mean, if you don't insert some humor, you'll just fucking cry, I guess.
it's really bad.
Yeah. So with the Tabram murder, she was murdered on a staircase in Whitechapel, specifically George Yard, on the 7th of August of 1888. She ended up suffering 39 stab wounds to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, abdomen, with additional knife wounds inflicted to her breasts and vagina. Apparently, they said that the wounds were inflicted with a bladed instrument, which could have potentially been a penknife. The wounds were inflicted potentially by a right handed person. And in this case, Abram was not raped, which I believe Smith was. So when you compare the two, the first one kind of sounds like fucking crazy gang members preying on an innocent person. This one sounds a little bit more similar to Jack the Ripper's profile.
Like, it would take so long to go through all the research because there were so many notes that don't just come back to or go back to the time period of the actual investigators at the time. We forget so easily, like the realm of England and stuff like that. They've been doing research on this for years and years. There are people who have been named on this case trying to unfurl all of the little twines that are sticking out to try to figure out what's going on. If you go back to the very beginning, you're talking about a time when, like you said, there are gang members who are inflicting crazy carnage that's being accepted in a way by the police. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is clearly gang violence. I wonder how and why the first victim became known as the Canonical Five. To me, like the way you described it and the way that I've also researched it, it makes it sound like there's still a seed of doubt there. But then you could also say, well, if this is a serial killer methodology, then maybe the first victim would be naturally confused with another crime because he was testing the waters, so to speak. He was kind of feeling out what he was going to do, the way he was going to do it. And after he got a sense of what that first kill was like, then he started to formulate what he wanted to do for future victims.
Yeah, and also with the Tabor murder, I guess officials at the time didn't really attribute it to Jack the Ripper because of what's the word I'm looking for? The profile of the murder. It wasn't
Right.
similar to
Yeah.
what Jack the Ripper did. This one was kind of like someone went berserk with stabbing like 39 times. When we go over the Canonical Five, you'll notice the similarities in which Jack the Ripper murdered these women. When I heard the term Canonical Five, I was kind of thinking to myself, why is it called the Canonical Five? And I'm sure you're probably thinking that while you're listening to this. And you probably thought the same thing, Dean. It's like, who the hell came up with this? Obviously, it refers to the five victims. It was widely accepted by most researchers and historians as definitely being killed by the same person. So they accept this as like official or authentic murders done by Jack the Ripper, distinguishing these from the other murders that took place around that time, essentially saying that these we can clearly tell was the same person, Jack the Ripper. The others we can't really tell. So that's
I agree with you. Okay, so we're going to get into the Canonical Five. And I have to say really quickly that the Canonical Five, when I heard it, I'm like, that sounds like Tolkien. Too bad it's, a shitty situation with death. It sounds like it'd be a really cool part of a novel. Like, the Canonical Five, they came together to destroy the bad, evil men. You know, like it sounds so cool, but then you're like, oh shit, it's actually the victims. The first thing I want to mention that wasn't really obvious to me at the time. I mean, it seems obvious now, but you think that a lot of these because when you think serial killer, I think nowadays it's like, oh yeah, it takes place over a long period of time because that's how entertainment and like Hollywood tends to portray it. It's like, oh, he makes 3 murders in a year and then disappears for 2 years, and then the investigator's on the job, like his regular job, and then suddenly poof, like there's another murder that's similar to what happened a couple years ago to the 3 murders, and it's like, well, it could be him, could be not. And then there's another murder, and it's like, okay, it's obviously him. And then, the chase ensues. This is different. This happened in a very short time period. So you're talking about, like as we mentioned, 1888, Whitechapel, impoverished, densely populated, lots of crime. This actually happened the summer heat of August 31st, 1888. The first victim is found. Mary Ann Polly Nichols. I don't know how accurate it was at the time, like the documentation and stuff. I assume it's very accurate. Based off our research, it says she was in her 40s. She was about 43 years old when they found her. And her background was that she was a homeless woman. She was struggling with alcoholism. She recently left a workhouse that was, basically a workhouse as a prostitution home. And she was last seen alive at 2:30 in the morning. So you can imagine 2:30 in the morning in Whitechapel with the maze of darkness. It's still pretty hard to make out what's going on. But she was reportedly she was drunk at the time. She was apparently seen last saying, "Soon have her das money," basically saying, "I'm going to go get my money to pay my lodging fees. I'll be right back." And then later she was found dead by a cart driver traveling through the street. So that's another interesting part where they found her, sounds like on a main drag, but the injuries that she had were the first part that was noted was a throat that was deeply slashed twice. And let me fucking tell you, that is the worst, in my opinion, the worst way to die for anybody is to have your throat cut. That is the worst way to die. I don't care what anyone says. Having your dick cut off and bleeding out. I would I would gladly take that over getting my throat slashed. It's just unbelievable that somebody, even with a mental illness, could do something like that. But like the throat slashing, you're talking about a deep cut, right? So she's probably bleeding out either while she's dying or after she passes away. The lower abdomen is severely mutilated. So there's stabbings into the gut, but even more creepily than the outlandish, brutal nature of the murder, there's a surgical precision injected likely after the body is deceased. It's into the stomach. No organs were removed, but you can tell that the person who did it was kind of playing around, right? They were kind of testing the waters to see what the surgery on the streets of a dead body would require, what they were looking for. Again, it's preliminary. I would say that this is definitely attributed to Jack the Ripper because this is the MO of some serial killer who's testing the waters, trying to figure out what he wants to do, why he's doing it. And that's why he went straight for the brutal kill and just kind of played around with the surgical incisions. You can see it gets kind of more methodical.
With the first victim, it was Marianne Nichols. She was murdered on August 31st. I believe you're looking, what, a week later? A little over a week later?
Yep.
On September 8th of 1888.
I have to inject really quickly because this is the first instance in our research where we found a physical location that is tied to the murder, which I honestly, I mean, it makes sense that it exists, but it's not something you think about until the information is presented in front of you. So Annie Chapman was supposedly found at 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields, London. If you basically Google that, you can find the street that happened on. And I'm looking around and it's like, it's relatively modern. There's some graffiti, but it's a one-way street, very, very close, very small, tightly packed area. And I'm just imagining like what this looked like with cobblestones and I'm sure like some of the buildings were demolished and rebuilt, so it might have been even smaller of a street back then. But it's kind of creepy to look at. Once again, it's 29 Hanbury, one word, Street, Spitalfields, England. And you can look for yourself to see where the body was found.
Dude, I actually did take a look at that, and it's not a very big street. And I would assume with, the modernization and all the deconstructing and rebuilding and everything like that, it probably would have been smaller. In what would we consider that area like still the late Victorian era?
Oh, definitely.
I would say maybe you want to cut that in half. That street in
Yeah,
half, and
exactly.
maybe that's what it would look like. I would
Yeah,
have to
four good
take a
strides across.
Yeah, I would have to take, like, a look to see if there were any, like, drawings or anything of that sort. The crime scene, I'm pretty sure there were, that could give you a distinct idea of how narrow these streets would have been. Continuing with
The description. Yeah, the description
Yep.
of Annie.
So apparently she was 47 years old when she was murdered.
That's
Appar
crazy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's fucking crazy. Oh my God. Like, that's just nuts to me, man. Like 47 in 1888, you're probably, you're like at least 5, if not 10 years away from your death.
Right.
Things are not working out for you. You're still a sex worker just trying to live. You cannot understate the heaviness of that situation for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Very rough life that they lived, and it's quite unfortunate that they got their lives cut short because of this prick. But prior to her being a sex worker, she was actually married. She had 3 children, but her husband ended up dying. And after his death, she ended up falling into poverty and alcohol abuse. Alongside with going through casual sex work to support herself, she sold flowers and little trinkets to survive. So she was found Approximately at 6 a.m., her injuries consisted of the following: her throat was cut deeply twice, her abdomen was completely exposed with the intestines, and her uterus was pulled out alongside with parts of her bladder. She was last seen at 5:30 a.m. talking to a man, heard saying, "No, I don't think so." And then they found her body 30 minutes later with the significant mutilation, indicating that this killer, Jack the Ripper, was working very quickly.
You're probably smart enough to realize this already, so I apologize if I'm insulting anyone's intelligence. So if somebody's walking up to her and requisitioning her, for her to say, "No thanks, I'm good," in her desperate situation, whoever was offering or proposing something to her must have been proposing something wildly crazy. But, like, it would take some really dark shit for someone to come up, probably younger than her, like, a younger person coming up, he's, like, probably trying to convince her to do some really shady shit, and she's like,
Right?
"No, it's so shady." It's like, "No, thanks." That's likely the killer. In my
Yeah.
mind, that's the fucking killer. And then you have the description of him that we'll talk about later. Not to make light of it, but the second victim is where I think the killer, whoever Jack the Ripper was, really found his voice in a way. Like, he was testing the waters in the first one. Now he knows what he wants. He's not sure how to get it yet. And then he tries to requisition this woman to get her to do something that he wants. She says no. It's like, okay, fuck it, I have to do it here. That's where the brutality ensues. So after she had all of that terrible stuff done to her uterus, bladder removed, all that stuff, what happens about 25 days later?
There's another murder. Murder of Elizabeth Stride.
So Elizabeth Stride is the first of what's deemed as the double event. And just to clarify, the double event means that there were two murders the same night. That's brazen. So if you had to ask me to assess the situation from a third party standpoint, looking at a serial killer, it's like, so we said earlier, he's not sure what he wants, right? He kills Mary Ann Polly Nichols, kind of gets a feel for it. It's more methodical. It's less intrusive. It's basically just a murder, and he's kind of playing around a little bit with it, surgical incisions. Then you get to Annie Chapman, where it's like, okay, clearly he's doing some more intimate stuff with removing the uterus and the bladder. Now you move on to, in my opinion, this is basically open season for Jack the Ripper. This is the moment where he's like, okay, I'm gonna fucking lean into it, right? So Elizabeth Stride, September 30th, 1888. She's found in Dutefield's yard off of Burner Street at approximately 1 in the morning. The only thing about this, though, was that her throat was cut and no further mutilation occurred. So this is obviously unlike other victims, right? So there's no further mutilation going on. There's no cutting of the organs or even testing out the waters of like what's inside of her. However, what's interesting is she was found by a man who was running a horse-drawn carriage. So it sounds like she was found in a very relatively populated area, right? So like, it's, even though it was very late at night, it was likely that someone was going to come along at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned it's late at night, but it might still be a populated area because apparently there was a witness, Israel Schwartz, who claimed he saw a man attacking Stride just before her body was found.
Yeah.
And they believe that the reason this murder was not as brutal as the others, and he just like slit her throat and just ran off, is because he was just
Got
like
busted.
it was interrupted. Yeah. Yeah. He didn't
Yeah.
want to take any more risks.
So the second victim of the double event on this night, September 30th, 1888, is Catherine Eddowes. And what's fascinating is it doesn't take place long after the original murder. So I would say that it's very likely, in my mind, that if you're talking about a serial killer who's responsible for multiple deaths, it would be these two. Because, like you said, whoever came across the murderer who was killing Stride at the time, he got caught. He didn't fulfill his MO, basically what he wanted to achieve. He got shooed away, and he's like, fuck, I have to do what I wanted to do. Like, I have to, like, he basically has to achieve fruition on this night, the night he chose to murder. So since he didn't get it through Stride, he goes off about 40 minutes later and finds Catherine Eddowes to fulfill this whatever fantasy or whatever he wants to achieve. He cuts her throat deeply, like the very first one. The face is mutilated, slashed. The nose and the ears are partially cut off. There's deep cuts around the eyes. The abdomen is ripped open once again, and the intestines are pulled out with fervor. The left kidney and part of the uterus are also removed. So the last two moments of that I just described are very important because the abdomen ripped open and the left kidney and part of the uterus being removed indicates to me that he was in a hurry. So that's like, okay, he got caught the first time. His heart's still racing, like he still got to taste the flavor of almost getting busted. So this second kind of exploratory murder, so to speak, is done with extra vigor. So he's doing it sloppily, right? So he only gets a little bit
Right.
out that he wants to get out. This is the worst part to me because, like, you think that you're going to get away, but these poor women who are in the streets, like the first one is brutally murdered, and you're like, okay, it happens once every a blue moon, then boom, like,
Like, what the fuck? And you know what makes it even worse? She was arrested for public drunkenness just hours before her murder. So she was released at 1 a.m. from the jail and she ends up being killed. Between 1 and 1:45 a.m. is when she ends up being murdered because her body ends up being found by police officer Edward Watkins. So talk about horrible timing. Because if you think about it, had she been detained for maybe 20 minutes more or something of that sort, she might not have
yeah,
been a victim. We
yeah,
would have been talking about somebody else, unfortunately. But what's interesting about this is how sloppily it was done.
yeah.
But when we
He
get
rushed it.
into the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, this one is considered to be the most brutal out of the five. Since you've been on such a good groove with the storytelling, why don't you detail what happened with the Mary Jane Kelly murder?
Right on. So this unfortunate situation surrounds Mary Jane Kelly, the last of the Canonical Five. It's important to note that as the first murder occurred, it wasn't long after, like a week and a half tops. That's when the second one occurred. So the double murder happened on September 30th, as we mentioned. November 9th is the last of the Canonical Five, Mary Jane Kelly. This Mary Jane Kelly is,
And one thing I want to interject really quick is how the other murders happened in fairly quick succession. Mary Jane Kelly wasn't murdered until November 9th. So you're talking about a little over a month between the murder of Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth Stride, and then the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. I found that very interesting. Do you think he had some fear of being caught because he's like, well, I did two the same night. The other body was found by the police. I was interrupted in the other one. I'm getting a little careless because Jack the Ripper is probably thinking, I need to scale this back a little bit. And I'm not trying to steal your thunder here, but what I found
no,
interesting about this particular murder is she was younger than the previous
yes.
four. She had a partner in Joseph Barnett, but they quarreled and she ended up living alone. And the third thing is that she was the only one that was murdered indoors.
Here is the golden catch line for this episode. Isn't it crazy that you and I and everybody else listening to this podcast can sit here and speculate accurately as to why somebody with a mental illness would act the way they do? It's basically, you're talking about investigatory forensics, right? This is what makes great detectives the way that they are. I think the creepiest takeaway from all the stories, that all of the details that we're talking about for this story, is that we're capable of understanding what a serial killer with a probably a deeply flawed mind, someone who has, all kinds of issues with their cerebral functions and their understanding of society and the functions within it. Like, we can sit here and postulate why someone would do it, yet you and I and everybody listening are not serial killers. That's the creepiest fucking thing in my fucking world. Like, we can understand it, but we won't do it. And I have to get that out there because I think this is the perfect point of the podcast to mention it, that we can understand the limits of social norms that exist for us right now. Because in the state of nature, going back like 1,000 years, if even 10,000 years, you're in the state of nature, you're hunting, you come across another tribe, you brutally murder them because they're going to like take your resources, right? They're going to take your power to whatever, like, replicate yourself or whatever. We see that nowadays with primates. So primates, they have groups that, like, roving male groups will go out. They'll search for other groups of primates that are not any different from them in terms of DNA, are like much different, and they will still obliterate them. They will still brutally murder them. And that's so insanely complex and creepy to me that like we can sit here and talk about some human who we're not talking about him operating in a vacuum, right? Like the person who did this is very, very likely to have a severe psychological issue. It's too complex to talk about now, but like it's such a very important part to talk about that whoever did this was methodical but also animalistic. Talking about Mary Jane Kelly, the most brutal murder happening, as you said, almost a full month after the last two murders on the same day. I think this is the culmination of a sick mind that came to fruition. And this is why it's the last murder. There's a lot of differences here. So, not only is the most brutal murder Mary Jane Kelly, she's also the youngest, like you said. And I think the reason why that's significant is because he's become what he sees as the ultimate brazen individual that he's trying to achieve. Like for a while, he was like, oh, I will go after easy subjects, I'll go after older ones, less desirable ones, like ones that are more sickly. But the fact that he went after a 25-year-old who's likely in good health, basically everything, the antithesis of what he's been looking at and killing up until now. So this is his way of achieving fruition. It's like, okay, I'm going to go after the young. I'm going to go full on. And the way that she was completely dismembered, her heart was removed, her organs were taken out, placed around the room intricately, and her abdomen and chest were her cavity, like the cavity of the chest was cut open, her heart pulled out, the face was completely mutilated beyond recognition. That to me says whoever did this was achieving fruition, like they're reaching the final state of what they're trying to do. I'm going to do it in a way that is intimate in her own establishment, her own room, and that's what he did. And the gruesome work he did with Mary Ann Kelly, I think encapsulates the culmination of what he was trying to achieve. The craziest thing I will say once again is that everybody listening can totally see that, but we would never do that. Like we would never partake in that. But this person, like they poured over the edge, they tripped over the edge, and this is the end result. The final culmination of a 5-person killing spree in the worst part of London in 1888. It really captures the human essence of what we're dealing with in terms of mental illness, but what we can also understand as like normal brains in society. Like you cannot take that away.
Yeah, this one is the most gruesome out of the canonical five. They say that you mentioned the heart being missing. There's speculation that it was taken by Jack the Ripper. So it's just fucking mind-boggling. And the first one indoors. So the rest of them were outside. And I wonder if it was in his mind he was playing a game. Let's see how fast I can do this before I can actually get caught. And maybe him actually being interrupted for the third victim and then rushing to kill his fourth victim. He probably thought maybe I need to do a little change here and let's do this inside. And this one was definitely the most gruesome when it comes to just straight up mutilation. It reminds me of what's his name, Sagawa, mindless
Yeah,
cannibalization.
right.
Issei Sagawa, yeah, that's the dude's name.
If you haven't heard our episode on Sagawa, go listen to it because it kind of aligns very well with what we're talking about. Like, so the individual Sagawa, like he never killed before. He had mental illness for a long time, right? But like it kind of culminated in this desire to go fulfill this what he believed is a destiny to end the life of somebody he was infatuated with, but also consume them to kind of become what he wanted to be. Like a tall woman, he's a short man, so he
He was
basically
very
killed her.
frail. Yeah.
Very frail. He was frail. He basically was like, I'm going to kill this woman because she won't reciprocate what I want. And it's almost kind of aligning to the Jack the Ripper case in a weird way, because I imagine Jack the Ripper, based off of the way he killed a lot of the women, he wanted some sexual fruition that was not being achieved through the actual practice, or maybe he just couldn't get it to begin with. There was something not being fulfilled by regular sexual acts that he needed to do through killing. And to jump back to the case, there's at least one instance of somebody witnessing Mary Jane Kelly before her murder. And this is what I find most fascinating. You have a firsthand account of somebody that's documented by the royal police who basically say like, okay, this person definitely saw the murderer. So the witness is George Hutchinson, and he claimed to see Kelly with a man right before her murder. about 2 in the morning. He said the man was about 5'7". He had a pale face, a mustache, dark hair. He was well dressed, unlike a lot of the other suspects who were in the list at the time. And he wore an astrakhan trimmed coat and a top hat. So if you're not familiar, an astrakhan coat, like look it up. It's a very fancy coat. It's a shorter coat, but he also had a rounded top hat that is not easily acquired at the time. And he carried a small parcel with him, like a small box or like a small package. And that stood out to the person apparently who was watching these two have an engagement talking. 10 Bells Pub is the last place she was seen alive at 2 in the morning. And not well after, she absconded away with this wealthy looking man with a package, and she was found dead not long after. And I think that like, if you ever had a moment in this case where there was some aha moment, it would be right here. Because like you have a firsthand account, the guy, whoever did all this shit, was being more brazen. Like you said, he's taking more chances. The last description of this guy with the mustache, the dark hair, the pale face, the well dressed, like that's probably who did it in my mind. Like he was too sloppy. He let himself be seen. So if you can peg that back to 5'7", pale face mustache, then you found your guy.
Before we wrap up today, I actually want to read a pretty famous or notorious letter that was potentially penned by Jack the Ripper that was addressed to the Central News Agency of London. This was dated September 25th of 1888, which takes place 5 days before the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The Dear Boss letter was written in red ink. It was 2 pages long. It has several spelling and punctuation errors. Clearly not well written. But essentially, the motivation was to mock the investigative efforts of the police and alluding to future murders, which did take place. So the letter says, "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for the jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I am a doctor now. Ha ha. So allegedly, that was Jack the Ripper mocking them for their efforts and stating, I can't wait to get back to work.
My only qualm with that is that he went on to say that I kept some blood from one of the murders, basically, in a bottle, in a root beer bottle, and it coagulated so much that I can't write with it. That's definitely something that happens, as we all know. I mean, like if you let your blood coagulate, you get a scab, right? Like it hardens over, it just becomes oxidized. I've never written with blood, but I can imagine that if you tried to write with old blood, it would be very coagulated. It wouldn't be a very good viscousy substance to scrawl something with. However, all he would probably have to do to make it like an ink to write with is to add some water, right? The fact that you have someone writing this and be like, oh, by the way, I can't write you in blood because it's too thick. I feel like any regular person would be like, well, if I added some water, like, just dip it in there and it would work. You would be able to write in blood if you added some water back to the thickened blood. So the fact that someone's like, oh, I can't provide you with DNA evidence because of this poor excuse, so I'll just give you red ink instead. That's kind of a red flag to me, honestly. it's possible that the killer was like, he wasn't smart enough to be like, if I add water or some other material, like I could write with it, but I can't. What do you think about this actual note that supposedly came from Jack the Ripper?
I've seen a few documentaries on Jack the Ripper, and they do reference this note, this letter, the Dear Boss letter.
Mhm.
And there's two camps. Some people think it's real, and there's other people thinking that it's a hoax, that
Yeah.
someone actually penned it to pretend to be Jack the Ripper and, get their little chuckle and fame out of it, which you mentioned people like to do just because they want to be involved in something. So I don't know. I'm stuck in between. I would like to think that Jack the Ripper was a little more, what do they say? A lettered gentleman or something of that sort
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
the nature of the crimes he committed, like with incision and all that other disgusting stuff. So I'm in the
Right.
middle. I think this is a perfect opportunity to close out the show with what we started talking about in the beginning with the suspects of Jack the Ripper. So apparently there have been over 100 suspects that have been proposed in the Jack the Ripper case, ranging from doctors,
Mhm.
butchers to aristocrats to artists, and even our buddy H. Holmes, who we did an episode on, was at one point accused of being Jack the Ripper because he had like a little hiatus. So they're like, oh, maybe he went to England and he decided, maybe I want to kill some people here. But I believe
Right.
that's been clearly debunked. It brings us to our number one suspect of Aaron Kosminski, who was a Polish barber living in Whitechapel at the time. He was known to have paranoid schizophrenia, and he was institutionalized in 1891. There was a witness that allegedly identified him, but never testified, so they couldn't really do anything to him. But this brings us back to the shawl with the DNA evidence of Miss Catherine Eddowes. I know you said in the beginning you were kind of skeptical on it just because of the way that, the DNA evidence might have been gathered and, the way that they actually did the analysis. I'm kind of in the middle in the sense that I completely get where you're coming from. And one thing I want to throw out there into the ether is, would it be really interesting and awesome to finally ID who Jack the Ripper was in Aaron Kosminski? Apparently, they say there's 100% DNA match because of the way they did it, the evidence that was pulled. But you also have to consider that this shawl is from like what, the 1880s, 1888, and it's passed hands a few times. And you have to take into consideration of contamination. If it's true that we finally ID Jack the Ripper 130 years too late, I mean, it is what it is. Whether we know who the identity is of Jack the Ripper at this point in time or not really doesn't matter. You get what I mean? Because it's not like you can go
Yeah.
to, if it is, definitely is Aaron Kosminski. It's not like you're going to go to his family, his extended family, and be like, okay, one of you have to surrender and go to prison for the crimes of Jack the Ripper. It's kind of like it matters in the sense that it's no longer a cold case.
It's a formality. It's
It's a
basically like,
formality. Exactly.
yeah,
It's like, well,
somebody who died a long time ago, like, lots of people died to the hand of other people.
mhm.
Like, this is just a way to close the case in a way. And who, well, like, regardless of what you think about the case, like, you just hope that whoever's involved in the murder is just resting peacefully.
Yeah.
And the last thing I will say about this, and I know some people will probably chastise me for this, but like, if you want to solve the case of serial killers who have a mental illness, it's not like, the way to solve it is to not completely berate them and demoralize them in a way that they are just completely subhuman, that they're just like shitbags, like, they are just like us who decided whatever. No, there's a mental illness here. Okay. And if you want to nip the mental illness in the bud to make sure nobody achieves that level again, you have to take it seriously in that regard. You can't just say, oh, they're just mentally ill, fucking kill them all. No, that's not how you solve the problem. If you want to break the chain of continual illness and murders and all this stuff that happens, like we've seen murders like this happen over the years, like, and I'm just talking specifically about illness that stems from pure treatable mental illness, right? I mean, there's a whole other argument in a realm to be claimed about people who don't have mental illness and they make decisions to kill people, whatever. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who have actual mental illnesses. And it's important to figure out who did this, because if you figure it out and it does turn out that it's like, whatever, this barber, this poor Polish barber who has already had a documented mental illness, then maybe going forward in the future, we can say, okay, well, this is the MO of the person. This is what they were going after. This is the foundation of the mental structure they had, the background, the upbringing. Maybe we can prevent this from happening again by not only stopping the murders, but also treating the person who is probably been abused, like all this other stuff, like, through their mental health. Like it's a really difficult subject, but like you cannot ignore it because it's just something that is inherently a part of our human existence. Like we said earlier, like if you are normal enough to fabricate an idea about what a a mentally ill person would do in a serial killer case, but you're not mentally ill enough to actually do it, there's a gap there, there's a bridge there. And like, why would you not pay attention to that? So like that's the last thing I'll say, where like we have to figure out what's going on, not because we're trying to solve the case itself, but because we're trying to figure out why a person would succumb to doing something this terrible. And that would pay homage to the actual people who were killed, and also pay homage to the idea that like no person is beyond a crazy level of abuse or internal struggle that would devolve into something like this. So like let's I hope we can figure out both, right? Let's figure out who did it, but let's also figure out who fucking solved the case, and also how we can prevent it from happening in the future.
Right. And to throw a little paranormal spin to it, the spirits of the victims, if they're not at rest, hopefully, this revelation that we just had a few days ago with the DNA evidence and linking it to Aaron Kosminski brings some closure. The whole thing that's it. That's the end. You're no longer viewing these people as, I mean, for the sake of this podcast, we unfortunately go into great detail talking about these situations, but from the outside, you're not viewing Jack the Ripper as some sort of fucking spiritual or like malevolent entity. There's like, we put a face to
Yeah,
the asshole. This is what he
right.
did, and these are the victims. That's the end of it. They finally have their closure. That people, albeit over 130 years later, finally know who did this, and their name can forever be tarnished. Folks, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know this one was a little bit more gruesome than we normally do when it comes to these true crime episodes. So we do hope you enjoy this episode, and we will delve into true crime every now and then for future episodes. Particularly for us, it's really difficult to read about these, let alone talk about this stuff. And we put a great deal of effort, and it is very mentally taxing. So we hope you enjoyed today's episode. If there are specific topics, true crime topics, doesn't even have to be a paranormal topic that you want us to cover in the future, go ahead and let us know. Reach out to us on social media, shoot us an email. We always love interfacing with the community, and we hope you have a good one. Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.